want to get right to CBS News Chief White House correspondent Major Garrett, who was at the president's event in Louisville. So, Major, it was a pretty lively crowd from what we saw earlier. What stood out most to you?
Well, large and lively crowd, Elaine. I can tell you here at Freedom Hall, which is part of the Exposition Center here in Louisville, Kentucky, standing room only. This place was absolutely packed to the rafters. Deep enthusiasm for President Trump, far outdistancing everyone who came to the podium as sort of a warm-up speaker. Vastly different reception for the president, adoring, raucous, much more tepid for the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, the most powerful Republican the state of Kentucky has had in more than 100 years. So even though Mitch McConnell is a reservoir of power and has rebuilt the Republican Party here and is a significant factor in every Republican election, every general election in this state, the reaction he elicited from this crowd was to be charitable, tepid, mild. The president, raucous reaction all through the night. And he gave a speech that, for Trump supporters, sounded exactly like the campaign speeches, except he has a few details to fill in. Now, this was advertised as a rally to help build support for the Republican effort to repeal and replace Obamacare. And the president did refer to that, but only glancingly. And he talked about one of the Republicans who were causing some problems for the White House, Rand Paul, another senator, the other Republican senator from Kentucky, who's called the current legislation Obamacare light, unworthy of any kind of conservative Republican support. All that President Trump would say about Senator Paul is, I like him, he's a good guy, and we'll get this done in some form or another, leaving all of the nitty-gritty of the legislative work yet ahead between the House and the Senate for another day. Just a blanket pledge, we'll get this done, then we'll get to tax reform and other parts of his agenda, so the president said. And he also made a long-running reference to the need for America First economic policy as it relates to trade, and he quoted a very famous Kentucky political figure, though not from our era, from a bygone era, Henry Clay and the Whig Party, talking about his approach to trade, which was free, equal, and reciprocal, and high tariffs to protect American jobs and American industry. That was a global economy much different than the one we live in now, but nevertheless, the president is on a Henry Clay, America First, protectionist-style message when it comes to trade economics, and the crowd here ate it up.
Well, Major, the big news, of course, in Washington Monday was FBI Director James Comey's testimony on Capitol Hill.
Sure.
The president talked about a lot of things at that rally that you were at, but made no mention of that fact. So what did you make of that?
Not one reference, not even a glancing one. We kept waiting here in the press area. Is he going to go off script? Is he going to do something to at least acknowledge this furious set of comments and back and forth between lawmakers and the FBI director, and a rather contentious White House briefing over what was said, what was disclosed, what's being investigated, what's the responsibility of the president to set the record straight after the FBI director says absolutely, matter-of-factly, and on the record, there's no evidence to support the president's still unsubstantiated claim that President Obama ordered Trump Tower to be wiretapped. White House still clings to that assertion, even though it can produce and has produced no evidence. The Justice Department has produced no evidence. And now you have on-the-record denials from the head of the FBI. The White House still clings to that. The president may still as well. Obviously, if the White House, in the form of Press Secretary Sean Spicer, clings to it, you can bet the president does as well. But not a mention of any of that controversy here in Louisville, Kentucky. The president, in every way, shape, and form, read every word off that prompter. A couple of small deviations from the prepared text, but here he gave a speech about his agenda, reflecting the campaign promises he made and the progress he has made so far and the progress yet ahead, and leaving it at that. Completely indifferent to Washington and what has Washington talking, and that, I would say, is a general observation that puts this president at his strength, ignoring what's going on in Washington and taking his particular message to a room full of supporters, and in this case, a packed arena that was absolutely packed, thousands here.
Maintaining that connection that he has with his base. I want to go back to this issue of health care that you mentioned a moment ago, Major. With a key vote planned for Thursday, you talked about the opposition by Senator Rand Paul, for instance, regarding some of his concerns, calling this Obamacare light. There's also concern among some moderates who worry that, in fact, this plan could hurt some of their older constituents. Well, we heard Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price acknowledging the bill is a quote-unquote fine needle that needs to be thread. How is leadership, Major, applying pressure here to both ends for conservatives and moderates?
Well, it's interesting. Pressure was tried, and pressure didn't work. The undecided moderates and the outright opposed conservatives in the House said pressure is not going to turn the tide here. You're going to have to change the bill. And the bill has been going through some rather significant alterations in its composition, and we are told there will be at least 2 amendments brought before the Rules Committee, which is the procedural committee that will have the last chance to set all of the content of this legislation before it reaches the House floor. Then, once the legislation is truly set, at least for House consideration, that's when the pressure will really ramp up. And it will be interesting to see how tax credits are handled in the legislation through this amendment that's going to, moderate Republicans hope, address this concern about higher projected costs for Americans in their 40s, 50s, and approaching Medicare age of 65. And it will also be interesting to see how much the new amendments reflect the concerns of conservatives, taking away part of the regulatory apparatus of the Affordable Care Act that they believe is still in this Republican alternative and shouldn't be there. That too much of the Affordable Care Act still lives on even under a Republican repeal and replace bit of legislation. So until we see those amendments and then we see the House members' reaction, we won't know the fate of this bill. But I can tell you this, Elaine, it was very easy last week to talk to House Republicans who had very grim prognostications about this bill even being voted on this week, let alone passing. I would say in the intervening weekend when the president was at work and some people came down to Mar-a-Lago and there was a lot of policy talk about what would be in the final House product, I'm picking up from House Republicans, I won't say a cautious optimism because that's a cliche, but they do believe if the vote is called on Thursday with these changes and with the president giving his very strong support for the bill, he will provide a lot of political cover and they'll have just enough votes to get this through the House and move it on to the Senate.
All right, we'll be watching closely. CBS News Chief White House Correspondent Major Garrett in Louisville, Kentucky. Thanks so much, Major.
Sure. Thank you.